Hello and welcome to Color Grading for Dummies. This involves DaVinci Resolve. I'm going to start a beautiful recording of the screen, a screen recording right now. Screen options, I don't need options. And we have started. Now let's go into some footage. Let's find some footage. I'm going to find some footage right over here. And this particular footage is HLG3. It doesn't really matter if you actually have phone footage or anything. You can do a light color grade on any kind of footage to make it a bit better. I'm going to put it in full screen so you see that it's quite red. The screen recording will seem way too saturated. Like you're going to see at the beginning of the video, the fact that it's a different color grade, so it's a bit less saturated. I'm going to try to go to the color page. This is DaVinci Resolve. If you use HLG3, you need to go to this wheel right on the right corner on the lower part. Go to color management. Then it's usually on DaVinci YRGB. Let's see how the colors look on that. And they look quite dull and yellow. So you need to change it to YRGB color managed if you have, and HDR if you have HLG3 that you're working with. And then let's go over on this page over here and go and add an adjustment clip. Adjustment clip, I already have one, but I'm going to delete it and I'm going to put a new one. It's always good to have adjustment clips because you can copy them from timeline to timeline, from project to project, and it's easier to work that way. The way I color grade is very, very different. In DaVinci Resolve, you can have a lot of ways to do the same exact thing. You can add contrast in so many ways. You can use the primaries, you can use HDR, you can use the contrast wheel, you can use even curves to add contrast. So the first is contrast. I like to use HDR. It's not because this is HLG, which is HDR footage. It's just because it gives you a softer contrast, and everything that I'm going to teach in this color grading tutorial is going to be free, and not in the sense that I'm not going to ask you for money. I'm not going to ask you for money, but free in terms of resources in the render. Whenever you render this video, it will not affect the render time. It's going to be exactly the same as if you were not adding any color grade. So that's very interesting because some tools in DaVinci Resolve, whenever you add color grades, are very taxing on the machine, especially effects or, let's say, mid-tone details and even contrast. Some ways of putting contrast and adding contrast to the video makes it very difficult for the computer. So I use contrast in this HDR wheels. Notice how it's quite soft, and I'm gonna start first right here on the shadows. Everything in HDR except the bottom line, everything over here at the bottom, in this where you have like temperature, tint, hue, contrast, pivot, and all these things. Some of them I don't know what they do, but all of them are taxing on the machine, the bottom ones. Everything in the middle, all these numbers, all these wheels are free. So I'm gonna refer to free and taxing for when it doesn't affect the render, it's free. When it affects the render, it's taxing. So I'm going to shadows and I'm going to lower the shadows. That's exposure, EXP. It's not experience, it's exposure. And I'm going to lower the exposure. I'm going to click right over here and lower the exposure until the shadows are really, really nice. Let's see how it looks without the color grade and with the color grade, that's fine. And now the second thing I'm going to do is lower the exposure on the lights. So the lights are a bit overexposed. I'm going to lower them a bit more. So first of all, you need to add contrast or take away contrast, depending on what kind of footage you have. That's the first thing you do in color grading. You either lower or make the highlights a bit higher, or the shadows, you make them deeper and richer. Okay, the second thing I do is I add another color grade, color node. I click here, I go add color node and corrector. And then I place it over this beautiful line until it's yellow, and it will automatically connect. And it connected. And then I go to primary wheels. Primary wheels. Everything in primary wheels that you find in the middle, it's free. Everything at the top and everything at the bottom, it's taxing for the machine. All I'm going to use is the offset. I'm going to use the offset to put the opposite color that is too much. Like, notice how it's super red. So we need to, the opposite of red is green. I do an addition, not a subtraction, because I don't want the saturation to go lower. So even though in this recording it will look like it's too saturated, in the actual footage, it's not going to look like that. That's just because QuickTime just adds a lot of saturation for no reason. I'm going to take it off. I'm going to take it out in the final render a bit. Hopefully it's going to look better. That's way too much. And I'm going to add just a bit, maybe to about here. Let's see, before, after, before, after. And now I'm seeing a lot of yellow. So the opposite of yellow, you're going to notice that there is no yellow here. It's red, green, and blue. But the opposite of yellow is blue. So I'm going to add some blue. And that's too much. And I quite like that. Okay, maybe a bit more contrast. Let's go back to the first node. You don't need two nodes. You can do everything in one node because it's not going to be taxing. It doesn't matter if you use an adjustment clip or you put the color grade on the actual clip. It doesn't matter if you use two separate nodes. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't affect the render at all. It makes no difference. So you can have all your color grading in one node. You don't have to create two nodes. I like to keep them separate so I can easily jump in between them and I know exactly which one is which. I'm going to lower the exposure on the shadows a bit more. And I like that. Okay. I'm going to increase this. Okay. And I need to lower the exposure over on the light part as well. And the overall exposure. So notice here, right here on the global, there is an exposure meter here as well. I like to keep my videos a bit on the higher end of this. So I have them a bit overexposed. And just like that, we have perfect color grade. That's all you need to know, basically. But if you want to do it another way and to make more interesting color grades, you can add another node and corrector. And then you need to put this over the line so it connects. And then go to the beautiful curves. Now curves, if you add you can basically, let's take off. That's another trick you can do. You can press on this number, and the grade disappears. And if you render it like that, it's not going to render with the color grade. It's going to assume that you don't want that. So with these two nodes disconnected or turned off, let's teach a bit about beautiful curves. The lower part of the curves on the left these are the shadows. So if you lower right over here, you're going to see you affect the shadows. See how you affect all the image because it's a curve. It's like that's why they are called curves. The more you go up with this, the more you affect the whole image, because notice how all the line is going. So a simple way to add contrast is to go a bit lower. So you increase the shadows, and you, well, in my case, I should decrease the highlights. But in the, if you want to add contrast, this is a basic S curve. So it adds contrast or takes it away if you do it the opposite direction. Notice how something else happened. A lot of saturation has, the colors have changed. That is because you have a chain over here that if you do press it and you press unlink and you reset everything, you're gonna use only the Y to do contrast, and that will not affect the colors, because before that you were affecting even these ones. So the colors. So let's redo that and add contrast this way. So this is a super clean way of adding contrast. It is noticeably more intense, and you have to really be super accurate to get a softer contrast, depending on the footage that you have. And another thing that you can do is you can do the same exact thing, like right over here on the sliders, depending on what you see in the footage. You can decrease the, well, not really. You have to first add some and then decrease it. So you can have finer adjustments by moving these wheels right over here. Like first you move the slider a bit up or down. Like for instance, this footage needs a bit of blue, and I'm gonna then go lower with the blues just so I get a bit finer adjustments. Now I'm gonna go to the white and lower the highlights and the specular highlights. So this in the corner is the specular highlights. Just over here, let's see, still a lot of red. So I'm gonna decrease the red, especially in the shadows. Okay. And I'm gonna lower it down. And I want the greens, well, the greens are not affected because I haven't touched them yet. I want the greens a bit high and a bit lower. Choop, boop. And then here's before and here's afterwards. Notice how there is a lot more saturation because you're playing with saturation in that way as well. Another way to add saturation, in fact, let's reset this node and put in these two nodes back again. Another way to affect saturation is, you can do it in many ways, but another way is to go onto the HDR node, and right here on global, you have saturation. So you can add a bit of saturation or a lot more depending on what you like. So I'm gonna set it back to 1.2. I'm gonna look at the footage. It looks nice, soft contrast. And then you can add saturation a different way, which is going on the curves, back on the curves, and go on to saturation and saturation, which I think is this one. Yes. And this is a very interesting way that you can add saturation because it doesn't do it on a global scale. Notice how this is very dark over here and very light over here. So if you want a little bit less saturation in the shadows and a bit more on the highlights, you can do an S curve right over there, and notice how, well, notice how it's taking away from the shadow. So it's taking that red, that pesky red of the HLG, and it's adding a bit more into the highlights. So it's balancing out the image a bit more. So that's another free way of adding saturation. It doesn't affect the render at all. Okay. And we've talked about contrast, color, and color contrast. Okay. And you can play around with these curves. The curves are entirely free. Everything is in the free version of DaVinci Resolve, actually. So it's also free by in that manner. You can also do the whole thing that you did with the primary wheels. You can do them in the saturation versus hue versus saturation, or hue versus hue. Yeah, hue versus hue. And you place some dots right on the lines, and now you have the whole spectrum of colors. Don't forget to add one at the end, either at the beginning or at the end. It doesn't matter. It's the same because this line is like, notice how if I put it up, it's continuous. So it's a loop. So let's lower the reds and a bit more of the, oh, I'm on the disconnected, I'm on the node that has the primaries. So I need to go on to this node and do the same, add the dots. I'm gonna move a bit faster and be a bit less accurate on the dots. It doesn't really matter because you can move them. So notice how it's a lot of yellow, so I'm gonna lower the yellow, well, actually increase the yellow. Let's see, yeah, increase them a bit. Lower the reds, and by lower I mean high. And the cyans, is this cyan? No, it's magenta. So here, and we can do before and after. So before and after, we have a much better and balanced color. I think hue versus saturation would have been way better to use there. So let's restart and go on hue, the hue and saturation, the second one. So I'm gonna first add 3 of them right over here. All you need is like 3, but anyway, yeah, this is way better. So it's doing the whole thing. It's lowering the saturation on things, and I want the greens to be a bit higher. And now let's add some saturation by going and add saturation. Let's restart. And you can do a simple curve just in the middle and add saturation in the midtones. That's usually where the saturation is, and the most saturation. And you can see before and after, before and after. Let's find a more beautiful frame so you can see my beautiful eye colors. Okay, right here. So before, after, and we have with this, it's gonna be okay. And you can play around until you find your desired colors and how you like to add all kinds of crazy colors. Even if it's phone footage, it's very good to add, to fix the colors, at least in the primaries or the hues, to really work with them in order to, let's stop the recording because that's the whole entire tutorial. That's why it's for dummies, because it's super simple. That's all I do almost 95% of the time. I just color grade that way, and it gets you to have a better footage. Like the main purpose of color grading is to have better footage, to have better contrast, better colors, more accurate colors, and that's just about it. I mean, it doesn't really matter what kind of footage you have. Even if it's a phone footage, you can increase or decrease the shadows a bit so you can make it better. You can change the white balance just a tiny bit by playing with the reds and the greens and the blues. So you can do that even if you don't have a professional camera. And I highly suggest it because you learn so much about how much you can push certain footage. Like, it's really crazy how this is what we were working on, and what you are seeing right now is HLG footage. And it's from the ZVE10. because there is HLG footage in 10-bit, but this is 8-bit. So it doesn't really have a lot of colors to work with. But because it's HLG, it has enough, as opposed to the regular color profile and color science, whatever. It doesn't have contrast baked in, and it really helps you get a bit more. And whenever you do a crazy color grade, it doesn't break so fast. Because if you have like regular footage from a phone, let's say, it's very noticeable when you change like the colors of the highlights and the colors of the shadows. You get a lot of noise and you get a lot of artifacts very, very fast, because you don't have the information there to push the footage. But this is a kind of a interesting trick to use the ZV-E10 to really get like super clean and soft contrast footage. It's super nice, and you can play around with color grading quite a bit until the footage breaks. So you can apply quite a heavy color grade, even like, yeah, just going crazy with the colors. But all you need to make sure is, with any camera and even with the phone, if it lets you, to have the proper exposure and the proper white balance, because that's baked in. Like you can push a bit the highlights and the shadows, but if they are to the extreme, you cannot bring them back because you don't have any information from there. So yeah, thank you for watching and see you in the next one.